folks. Hello to a different audience. Like Tanya said, my name is Carol, and I'm a clinical scientist, and we'll be talking about using clinical science to tackle this wonderful thing called code review anxiety. So I'm going to start with a little story, okay? All right, so 2 years ago, I was a psychology professor. So the thing about being a psychology professor is that you still write code, you still run analyses, and you still do research. What you don't do is use this thing called GitHub, okay? So 2 years ago, I started that Pluralsight, site, and they were like, time for you to get ramped up on GitHub. And I was like, excellent, have never seen this thing, have never used this thing. So I pull up the GitHub, and I'm like, okay, I can figure this out. I have a PhD. I'm sure I can figure this out. Open up the GitHub, see that we have this thing called a repo, see that code goes in there, and I'm like, excellent. I go ahead and copy my entire data analysis workbook at the time, which was like over 1,000 lines of code, and I just like pasted that sucker right in and pressed submit, and I was like, did the GitHub. Like, that's amazing, right? And then I like go back to my workbook, like add some things, change some things around, have this like genius moment where I'm like, Carol, you're supposed to update the repo on the GitHub. So I copied the entire workbook again, paste that sucker in as a new commit, and press submit. And I'm like, I have done the GitHub 2 times. I'm like, pretty sure I'm crushing it. I'm so confident in myself that I publicly post in my team channel, and I tag the entire channel because I'm like, everyone must read this. Truly great. And I'm like, okay, this doesn't require review because I obviously did it right. But I just want to publicly say that we have code in GitHub. Feeling really pumped and proud of myself for diving into this thing. TBD if I actually did it right. Have this like celebrating dancing thing because that's how I feel. My teammates who have not seen what I have done yet send react really kindly. My manager also has not seen what I've done yet, says phenomenal with a ton of exclamation marks, right? Some things here. Really love that I say it doesn't need review. Like there's a lot of unearned confidence here. But there's a moment where I'm like, you know, that was kind of a weird process. Like, how are people supposed to know what's new? Like, do you just like spend a lot of time reviewing code? Like, what's the deal here? So I have this moment where I'm like, TBD if I actually did it right. And of course, I did not, right? And so I get some really nice feedback, but even though it's really nice, I have my first experience with code review anxiety. So we have sad, distressed Carol here. By the way, I have no idea when this picture was taken. I have no recollection of this, but I am very distressed, and I have no idea why. Maybe it's the French fries. Anyway, so in this moment, I have this very irrational thought, like, that was a really stupid mistake, right? I should have known better. She, my manager, probably regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent. I just like have this thought here. And this is my first experience with code review anxiety. So what is code review anxiety? You can think about this as a fear of judgment, criticism, and negative evaluation while giving or receiving code reviews. Very, very simply, it's anxiety you feel during a code review, okay? So the thing about code review anxiety is that it's actually pretty dang common. And anybody can experience this. So it's not just a junior developer thing, for example. And in fact, in my research sample, folks had anywhere between 1 to 65 years of coding experience. I had folks who were like, I had no idea this thing was a thing. Like, I just know that I feel terrible about code reviews, and I felt this way my whole life. Yeah, I guess that's anxiety. And I was like, welcome, right? So just to kind of highlight this, I want you to raise your hand if you've ever felt anxious about giving or receiving a code review. Yeah, raise your hands, because I know we felt it. Like, come on. Yeah, a lot of us have felt this, right? Now I want you to raise your hand if you've actually talked about that anxiety with your teammates. So a lot less raised hands, right? Which makes a lot of sense. Generally speaking, we don't talk about our anxious experiences like code review anxiety in the workplace. So the thing about not talking about your experiences is that it makes those experiences really invisible. And so with code review anxiety, we're in this situation where our experiences feel really invisible, and because of that, we feel really alone in those experiences, even though we're not, right? We all just raise our hands, like this is a pretty common thing. And so very, very, very quickly, the ethos of this project became about showing people, hey, listen, you are not alone in your code review anxiety. You're not crazy. you're not weird, you're not unskilled for having code review anxiety, because code review anxiety is in fact quite normal. Most importantly, though, I really wanted to show people that there's something that you can actually do about your code review anxiety. Because just because something's normal doesn't mean that it can't still be a blocker, right? It gets in the way of our well-being, our lives, career progression, et cetera, et cetera. And that makes a lot of sense because one of the core outcomes of anxiety is this lovely thing called avoidance. So generally speaking, you feel anxious about something, you get rid of the thing, and you're like, excellent, my anxiety's gone, right? Like, great short-term solution. In the long term, though, this actually makes your anxiety a lot worse, okay? It also prevents you from actually accessing any benefits from the experience. So in the case of code reviews, it's been documented that it improves code quality, code security, creates learning and knowledge transfer, builds trust, community building, et cetera, et cetera. So like, TLDR, if you want to actually benefit from code reviews in your org, you actually need to figure out how to mitigate that code review anxiety first. So how do we do that? And I wanted to do this in a science-driven way as a scientist, okay? And I really want to double down on this science-driven piece. Because if you go onto the interwebs and you're like, code review anxiety, what do I do about it? People have lots of thoughts, as they normally do, right? And a lot of times these things, their methods, aren't very scientific and actually make your anxiety worse. So for example, one thing that folks will do is say, hey, listen, we're just going to dismiss code review anxiety. It's something that experienced developers just grow out of, okay? This is pretty flawed. Like we mentioned, anyone can have code review anxiety. It's not an experience issue, right? The other thing is that even if we did just kind of like naturally grow out of code review anxiety, you still deserve support in the interim, right? Like you don't really want to say, listen, things are shitty right now. They're going to be shitty for several more years. Oh well, right? Like you want to like be a little bit more helpful than that. The second thing that folks will do, and this is more common actually, is that folks will focus on your coding abilities instead of your anxiety. So folks will say like, hey, here's like what you can do to write better code, cleaner code. There's this idea that if your code is solid, there's nothing to feel anxious about, right? I see a lot of nodding heads here. Maybe you've done that. It's okay if you have, right? But the problem with this is that, of course, it is very, very, very possible to feel very, very anxious about something you did really, really well. I like to say that anxiety isn't merit-based. It's not something you deserve, and it's not something you earn your way out of. It's literally something that just happens to us all, okay? So how do we actually do this in a science-driven way then? So step one, as a scientist, you really want to develop an empirical model of code review anxiety. This helps us identify the key mechanisms that actually lead to anxiety, and this helps us create a more targeted intervention. Instead of just like throwing things at the anxiety and being like, hope this works, right? Like you want to like have some method to this madness. So here is our model of code review anxiety. This is generated using a path analysis. If you are a stats person, if you're not, that's okay. And the idea is that if you have code review anxiety and you're faced with a code review, 3 cognitive biases are triggered. The first is anxiety self-efficacy. This is typically lower, okay? This is when you believe that you're unable to tolerate or manage your anxiety. So you might have folks say things like, oh, I just really can't do this. Right? Like, I don't know if I can handle this. Like, nah, I don't know, right? The second thing is an elevated cost bias. This is when you overestimate the cost of something bad happening. So instead of saying something like, made a mistake, that sucked, oh well, you're like, made a mistake, and this is now the end of my freaking career, right? And then finally, you have an elevated probability bias. This is when you overestimate the likelihood of something bad happening. So here, instead of saying like, may or may not break production, who knows? You're like, I probably broke production. Like, damn it. We see here that cost bias and self-efficacy actually directly increase code review anxiety. And here we see that self-efficacy is the primary driver of this relationship. In other words, if we want to target code review anxiety, we really want to make sure that we're targeting that self-efficacy piece at a minimum. Okay? We've got a nice little target here. Unsurprisingly, anxiety does lead to avoidance as well, as does the probability bias. And again, anxiety is the primary driver of this relationship, and that lets us know if we want to reduce code review avoidance, we really got to focus on mitigating that anxiety as predicted, okay? So we have our targets, we have self-efficacy, anxiety, avoidance. Now we want to go ahead and actually develop that intervention, right? I did this using a single session cognitive behavioral workshop over Zoom. Chose this method because, one, cognitive behavioral workshops have been shown to have really good outcomes by decreasing anxiety, decreasing avoidance, and also improving self-efficacy. So it's like our 3 major targets. Yay. And then also, because it is single session and over Zoom, it's more accessible. Folks anywhere can tune in. You don't have to travel to this thing. And because it's only a single session, there's a lower time burden, right? You don't have to commit to like a repeating meeting all the time. Consistent with cognitive behavioral approaches, we have 4 kind of main steps to this, 4 parts. The first step is to actually teach folks how to assess their anxiety. We do this because it's pretty hard to do something about your anxiety if you don't even know it's happening, right? Like that's kind of like a needed first step here. Second is to teach folks how to reduce any intense physiological arousal. We do this because it's just really, really, really hard to think or act rationally when you have intense physiological symptoms, right? So for example, if you are hyperventilating, you're not like, how can I approach this code review in a rational manner, right? You're like, I can't breathe. I just need to figure out how to breathe, right? And so we teach folks how to mitigate that as a next step. Next, we actually teach folks how to challenge their biased thoughts. And we do this because anxiety generally functions by making us think pretty negative things about ourselves and the world around us, right? When we're super anxious, we're not like, man, I am so awesome, crushed it, right? When you're really, really anxious, you're like, wow, I am a piece of trash and I suck at this, right? Just to be real. So, we want to challenge those thoughts. And then finally, we want to teach folks how to reduce that avoidance by proactively engaging with the code reviews, again, because avoidance makes our anxiety worse in the long term, okay? I'm not going to go over all of these things because of time, but I am going to go over challenging biased thoughts because that's kind of the meat of the intervention. All right, first step here is, again, identifying those thoughts. Really hard to challenge a thought if you don't even know you're having it, right? So we have like sad, distressed Carol here again, and she's thinking she regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent, right? Just to give you an idea of other thoughts, these are real thoughts from real participants. One person was like, this code review is how I die. Like, this is what I'm thinking before a code review. Kind of more heartbreakingly, someone said, I will never get the developer that reviews my code to respect or like me. One person said, I'm always going to be the least smart and competent person on my team. And then actually a staff engineer said, I have too much experience to be freezed at this kind of thing. I feel really ashamed. You can imagine that if you're walking into a code review thinking, man, this person is never going to respect my work. That is not setting you up for less anxiety. In fact, that's setting you up for even more anxiety during that code review, right? So after we identify that thought, we're going to identify any thinking traps. We're going to verify this is indeed a negatively biased thought. Same thing here. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'm going to go over the ones we see in my lovely negative thought. She regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent. So we see some catastrophizing here, right? I'm predicting something really, really bad is going to happen without any evidence. At no point did my manager say, hey, Carol, did you know that you are super incompetent? Which would have really sucked, by the way, right? And at no point did she say, man, you know who I regret hiring? You. Like, that also did not happen, right? So no evidence for this. I also engage in some dichotomous thinking. I'm only considering the extremes. I'm either incompetent or I'm like pretty amazing. There's nothing in between here. I also engage in mind reading. I believe that I know what this person is thinking, even though I literally cannot read minds. And I also engage in overgeneralizing. I take this one instance and I see it as indicative of all other instances, right? This means something about me as a scientist now, not just me and the GitHub. Next step is we're going to actually challenge those thoughts. We don't really want to say, yeah, you got these negative thoughts. Oh, well, like, sucks. So we're going to actually challenge these things now. We We do this by asking ourselves some guided questions. So I might ask myself, okay, Carol, am I 100% sure of this? And the answer is no, I'm actually not 100% sure of this. I might also ask myself, okay, am I placing unrealistic and unattainable standards on myself that I wouldn't expect another person to achieve? And the answer here is yes. It's my first time doing this. I would never expect someone who had never seen GitHub to be like, I used it perfectly, right? Maybe you do, I don't know. And then finally, I might ask myself, hey, does making a mistake really mean that I'm incompetent? And the answer here is no. Everyone makes mistakes, right? Superstar coders make mistakes. Superstar scientists make mistakes. That's not incompetence, that's just like a literal part of learning, right? After this, we're going to develop a rational response. This is like a more realistic and self-compassionate point of view. So instead of telling myself, okay, she probably regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent, I might instead say, okay, everyone makes mistakes. It's a part of learning, right? A little bit more realistic, definitely a lot more self-compassionate. So you might be thinking, okay, cool technique, does it actually work, right? Which is like always important. So in the next step, we actually empirically test this intervention. So I did this with 59 developers who experienced code review anxiety, and I used something called a randomized control trial. I used an RCT because this is a standard method for clinical trials. It also makes sure that any effects we see are actually because of the intervention. So things like anxiety, sadness, cognitive ability, right? They don't, we're not stable at the same level all day, every day. It naturally changes over time. And so we want to make sure that any changes we see are actually because of this intervention, not just because, hey, anxiety changes over time, right? So the findings. Yay! Our intervention does decrease anxiety, code review anxiety. Developers felt less anxious when faced with the code review. You can see this when you compare these two charts here. So if you look at the workshop group, you see that there's a larger decrease in anxiety compared to the control group, where there's not much decrease at all. There's also an increase in anxiety self-efficacy here. So same thing here, there's a massive increase in self-efficacy for folks in the intervention group, and not much change at all for folks in the control group, right? This means that folks were better able to tolerate and manage their code review anxiety. And then finally, as a fun little bonus, our intervention also increased self-compassion, which is awesome. Folks were kinder to themselves, they were more validating, and again, same thing here. You see that the workshop group, there's a larger increase in self-compassion compared to the control group, where there is no change whatsoever. So it works. Now what? You're like, I wasn't in this study, so how do I actually take advantage of this besides listening to you talk about it, right? As a first step, talk about code review anxiety on your teams. Like I mentioned earlier, not talking about an experience makes it feel really invisible, and when our experiences aren't invisible, we feel really, really alone in them, even though we're not. And again, it is just so important for people to know that they're not alone in their anxiety, that they're not crazy, they're not weird, they're not unskilled for having anxiety, that code review anxiety is normal, and that most importantly, there is something that they can actually do about it. Just to kind of hammer this home a little bit, here are some quotes from folks who participated and then posted about this, or folks who actually just read the science paper and talked about it with their teams. So one person said, I left having never felt so seen. To be in a Zoom room with other developers who experienced similar levels of anxiety was truly priceless. Even after the session ended, a few other devs and myself stayed on with Carol for about 20 more minutes. The psychological safety of that Zoom room felt special, and I wanted to absorb it for as long as possible. Okay. I should mention that this happened in multiple Zoom sessions, right? Where folks stayed longer because it just felt really, really nice to feel like you weren't weird for having anxiety. Where folks felt like, hey, it's pretty normal to have code review anxiety. There are other staff engineers experiencing code review anxiety. I don't have to be ashamed about this, right? That feels really, really nice. Another person said knowing that code review anxiety is an almost universal experience has really helped with feelings of imposter syndrome, acknowledging that it's a real thing, knowing other people, regardless of experience or skill, have similar thoughts and experiences, and having techniques to deal with it has been really incredibly empowering and valuable. Again, knowing that you're not alone, right? Knowing that you're not crazy. And importantly, knowing that there's actually something you can do about this, right? That's really empowering for people. And then finally, someone who wasn't in the study but found the paper somehow, shared it with their team and talked about it. They were like, hey, we ended up having a few people commenting along the lines of, I'm so glad to hear this isn't just a me problem, right? Again, highlighting even talking about code review anxiety with your team, opening that dialogue can have a really big impact. But maybe you're like, well, what's with the intervention then, right? So to help you with that, if you wanted to actually work through the stuff we talk about in this intervention, we also developed a code review anxiety workbook. This is a self-guided and self-paced workbook that distills the intervention that we tested for you. It is freely available. It's for you to use. Download it, print it out, bookmark it, work on it by yourself, with your team, do whatever you want with it. It's yours, okay? So TLDR, one, read the paper if you are so inclined. Definitely download the workbook. But also know that code review anxiety is really normal. It impacts folks across experience levels. If you, as a staff engineer, are like, yeah, I experience code review anxiety and I don't really talk about it, know that you're not alone, first of all, right? Also know that code review anxiety can be a blocker. It leads to things like avoidance, procrastination, and it's often maintained by things like low anxiety self-efficacy, so feeling like you can't manage that anxiety. And then finally, and most importantly, we can absolutely do something about it. In fact, a single cognitive behavioral workshop can reduce that anxiety, increase your self-efficacy, and then also increase your self-compassion, which is pretty cool. And then finally, thank you to my wonderful code review anxiety teammates, Kristen Foster Marks and Kat Hicks, both of whom supported this project. Yeah, reach out. See you in the office hours.